can.
Cannibal House. The story begins at a time radio station late at night. Mordom enters to host a show in an eerie, quiet atmosphere. He feels a chill and sees footprints. Then a crew member surprises him, explaining the quiet is due to a holiday. They need to start the show soon. Mordom asks about James, his co-host. In the recording room, they find someone under a blanket, thinking it's James, who seemed unwell on Instagram. They let him rest, and Mordom starts the show. During a segment for Spooky Stories, a caller named Elle shares her story, The Cannibal House, which began when she was struggling as a freelance writer. The doctor noted the office's quietness. He mentioned the show starts in 5 minutes. Entering the recording room, they found someone under a white blanket, assuming it was James. They let him sleep, and Mordom began the show alone. A caller named Elle shared her story, The Cannibal House. She explained it started when she was unemployed as a freelance writer. Just as all seemed lost, she found something life-changing. So they let James sleep, and Mordom started the show alone. When he started the segment where listeners called to share spooky stories, a caller named Elle called her story The Cannibal House. She said her story began when she was unemployed as a freelance writer, but it wasn't going well. 2 months without work, her savings dwindled. Then, she found something life-changing. She talked to a friend who suggested writing online novels or selling old stuff. She said if desperate, she'd try that. Her friend also suggested asking her ex-boyfriend for work. It's been 2 months since she had work. She was on the phone with a friend who suggested writing online novels or selling old stuff. Her friend also suggested asking her ex-boyfriend for work, as he often found jobs for her when they dated, but she had always declined, saying it was too soon after their breakup. Then the scene cuts to when she was on a call with a friend who suggested writing online novels or selling old stuff while unemployed. Elle said if she hit a dead end, she'd consider it. Her friend suggested asking her ex for work, in case he had something. Elle remembered he often found her jobs, but she turned them down, saying it was too soon after their breakup to ask him for work. Later, she got a message from a strange number, offering a caregiver job for 3 days and 2 nights with good pay. Intrigued, she called back, but the voice was grating, and the call disconnected. She texted back, but the reply was the same ad repeated. Frustrated, she typed, because when she was dating Part, he often found work for Elle to do. But Elle refused it, because she said that they had just broken up, and she had to go back to her ex-boyfriend to work. It wasn't like they hung up on each other before. She got a text from an unknown number saying they needed an elderly caregiver for 3 days, 2 nights, well paid. Intrigued, she called back, but the voice was grating and it disconnected. She texted back, but got the same ad repeated. Frustrated, she said she wanted the job and would start if paid first. She tossed her phone, thinking it was a scam, but as soon as she ignored it, her bank notified her of a deposit, then got a location from the number. Since she got the money, she packed and drove there. The road was desolate and eerie, but she arrived. Ella wanted the job and awaited payment. Ignoring a suspicious message, she was surprised by a bank deposit. She received a location, drove there, and found a silent servant. Introducing herself, she entered the house and the door shut behind her, leaving her confused. When she acted disinterested, she got a bank message about a money transfer and a location from the strange number for work. Having received the money, she packed and drove to the location. The road was desolate, but she arrived. A male servant met her at the house. She introduced herself for the job as per the message. The servant silently led her inside, and the door closed by itself. Ella felt confused. She reached the elderly woman's room she was to care for, and met another silent female servant who led her to her room. When Ella asked what to do, the servant didn't respond, so Elle followed quietly. When she got out of the car, she encountered a male servant waiting for her in front of the house. Elle introduced herself, saying she was there for the job as agreed in the message, but the servant didn't say anything and just led her into the house. As soon as she took her first step inside, the front door closed by itself. Elle felt confused and bewildered, not knowing what to do or where to go. As she walked into the house, she reached the elderly woman's room she was to care for, encountering another silent servant. The servant led her to her room without a word. When Elle asked what to do, the servant didn't respond, so Elle followed quietly. She noticed no cell phone signal and asked the servant, but got no reply, frustrating her. She comforted herself, thinking it was only for 3 days. Eventually, the servant brought her back to the elderly woman, though no one explained. Elle understood her job was to care for the paralyzed woman. She introduced herself, but the woman didn't respond. Ella noticed no phone signal and asked the silent servant, which frustrated her. She reassured herself it was only 3 days. The servant led her to the paralyzed elderly woman. The servant didn't respond, which started to frustrate her, but she tried to comfort herself, thinking that it was only for 3 days. and then she would be out of there. Eventually, the servant brought her back to the elderly woman, and even though no one told her anything, she understood from the message she received that her job was to take care of the elderly, which was the woman in front of her. She introduced herself, but the elderly woman didn't move or say anything, and Elle realized that the woman was paralyzed. For a moment, while the elderly woman lay still, she suddenly turned and smiled at Ella, startling her. Meanwhile, a male servant brought a book for Elle to read to the woman. Ella read until the clock struck 7, signaling the end of her work. She wondered if she would end up like the woman, alone and bedridden. Noticing an incense holder, she wondered who lit it. Before she could think more, the servant silently took her back to her room. Ella mentioned she hadn't eaten, and the servant soon brought her a meal. She realized she had to care for the woman until 7 each night. On the first night, she encountered something strange while trying to sleep. She feared ending up like the elderly woman, alone with strange servants. She saw an incense holder by the bed. A servant took her back to her room. Elle said she hadn't eaten and got a meal. She had to care for the woman until 7, then could leave until morning. That night, she heard a bell and chanting, but it stopped when she checked. She thought she heard children laughing. She used her phone's flashlight to explore. The elderly woman's bed was central in the house, and as she left her room, she saw the woman lying there. Everything seemed normal. But before she could shake off her curiosity, the servant came in and led her back to her room without saying a word, just like always. She casually mentioned that she hadn't eaten yet, and within a moment, the servant brought her a meal and then closed the door. She figured out that she would have to take care of the elderly woman until 7 o'clock, and then could leave the room until morning. However, just in the middle of the first night, she encountered something strange while trying to force herself to sleep. She thought she heard the sound of a bell or something, along with the sound of someone chanting, so she opened her room door to check, but the sound stopped. However, she felt like she heard children laughing. Since she didn't believe in ghosts, she turned on the flashlight on her phone and walked out to explore the house. The elderly woman's bed was prominently placed in the middle of the house, and as she stepped out of her room, she saw the elderly woman lying there, but everything seemed normal. She walked to the kitchen and opened the pantry. She saw rice cakes and joss paper for offerings, which puzzled her. As she pondered, a hand grabbed the joss paper, leaving her momentarily stunned. Unafraid, she used her phone's flashlight. She saw a hand from the cupboard before it closed. Children's laughter echoed, and she thought it might be the elderly woman's family, but the cupboard was empty. Something ran past her with laughter, but nothing was there. She stepped on joss paper, and when she picked it up, the servant appeared, asking if she saw the child. The servant silently held her arm and led her. Then, a child appeared on the clock in front of her room. She spotted a hand from the cupboard. Children's laughter echoed. She thought it was the woman's family, but the cupboard was empty. Suddenly, something ran past her with laughter. She stepped on joss paper, and the servant appeared, grabbing her hand, asking about the child. The servant didn't respond, but pulled her along. A child appeared on the clock. The next day, she wondered if ghosts were real or imagined. Not a believer, she comforted herself. Her work was similar, caring for the woman and reading, with new tasks. She accidentally stepped on the joss paper on the floor, and when she picked it up, the servant suddenly appeared, grabbing her hand, and asking if she had seen the child in the house just now. But the servant didn't say anything or respond, just held her arm and pulled her along. Then the scene showed a child sitting on the clock, appearing right in front of her room. The next day, she was preoccupied with thoughts of last night, questioning if ghosts were real or just her imagination. Not believing in such things, she reassured herself it was just one night. Her work was similar to the previous day, caring for the elderly woman and reading to her, but with a new task, wiping the woman's body. While doing so, the basin water turned blood-like. Suddenly, a little girl appeared, pointing at the woman's arm. Ella saw a bruise, startling her and causing her to spill the basin. In the water were silver coins, and she noticed the girl under the bed. When the servant cleaned up, everything seemed normal again. The woman's arm was fine, and the water was clear. She had to wipe the elderly woman's body, but while she was doing that, the water in the basin suddenly turned a color that looked like blood. A little girl appeared in front of her, pointing at the elderly woman's arm. When Elle turned to look, she saw the elderly woman's arm had what looked like a bruise, which startled her, and she lost her balance and knocked the basin over, spilling water everywhere. In the basin, there were some silver coins, but that wasn't all. She also spotted the little girl under the bed. When the servant came in to clean up the spilled water, everything seemed to return to normal. The elderly woman's arm was fine, and the water in the basin was no longer the blood-like color she had seen. The little girl who had appeared had vanished without a trace. When the servant wiped the floor, everything returned to normal. The woman's arm was fine, and the water was clear. The girl vanished. That night, she saw the girl jumping before running out. As she tried to follow, the door locked. The girl vanished. That night, she saw her again, But that night, reflecting on the events in the house, she saw a little girl jumping in the room before running out. When she tried to follow, the door locked, trapping her. She noticed a notebook on the table. Opening it, she saw people, but only one seemed to float. A little girl whispered in her ear in Chinese, which she didn't understand. The image showed people being burned. She threw the notebook away, revealing it was Sunday, August 16th, tomorrow. She started hearing bells, chanting, and children's laughter, making her feel confused. Since tomorrow was the last day, she decided to stick it out until the end. A girl whispered in her ear in Chinese. She didn't understand, but suddenly the image showed people burning alive. She threw the notebook, revealing Sunday, August 16th, tomorrow. She heard bells, chanting, and laughter more often, with Chinese words she couldn't understand, leaving her confused. Since tomorrow was the last day, she decided to stick it out. The final day, August 16th, came. She followed her routine, caring for the elderly woman, glancing at the clock, wanting it to be 7. Once it was 7, everything would end. As quitting time neared, she freaked out, seeing scary things like before. She was completely confused about what was happening to her. Since tomorrow was the last day, she gritted her teeth and decided to stick it out until the end. And then came the last day, which was August 16th, as written in the notebook. On that day, she went about her usual routine, taking care of the elderly woman. But she kept glancing at the clock more and more often, desperately wanting it to be 7 o'clock. Because once that time came, everything would be over. However, it seemed that the closer it got to quitting time, the more she started to freak herself out, seeing all sorts of scary things just like the day before. The sight of the blood-like water and the bruise on the elderly woman's arm was overwhelming. She thought she was minutes away from finishing her shift and would get through this. The little girl appeared again, speaking the same Chinese phrase and pointing at the elderly woman's bed. Ella was shocked. The paralyzed woman was floating in the room. The male and female servants stood still, just like in the notebook. A red cloth bag was on the floor. She found a photo of herself with her ex-boyfriend. The elderly woman repeated the Chinese phrase Ella couldn't understand. The incense her ex-boyfriend held caught fire, confusing her. She remembered the notebook's image. The place would catch fire soon. She needed to escape quickly, so she rushed to her room to gather her things. It floated with the servant still. She noticed a red bag on the floor. Inside, she found a photo. The elderly woman repeated a Chinese phrase. Suddenly, the child and incense caught fire. Where was she? She remembered the notebook image. The place would catch fire soon. She needed to escape quickly. The room's walls showed burn marks. Smoke filled the air, and the house seemed on fire. The elderly woman and servants had burn marks, yet the woman repeated the phrase. She decided to leave. Suddenly, her child's toy and the incense caught fire, confusing her. Where was she? What was going on? She needed to escape quickly. Rushing to gather her things, the room's walls showed spreading burn marks, and smoke filled the air. Then a charred hand grabbed her arm, covering her mouth, making her weak and dizzy from the smoke. Just then, the little girl appeared again, pointing to a small wooden bridge, indicating Elle's way out. Elle summoned her last strength to shake off the hand. At the same time, she noticed that the walls of the room were starting to show burn marks, spreading everywhere, and there was smoke filling the air, as if the house was on fire. The elderly woman and the servants also had burn marks on their bodies. Yet the elderly woman kept repeating the same Chinese phrase. Everything felt chaotic and urgent. So she decided she had to get out of that house. But then, she was grabbed by a charred hand that covered her mouth, leaving her weak and dizzy. Just then, the same little girl appeared again, and beside her was a small wooden bridge. The girl pointed to the bridge, indicating it was her escape. Seeing this, Elle gathered her strength to shake off the hand. She ran across that bridge, and she realized she was in a temple courtyard. Beside her, something burned, and Elle saw it was a Chinese funeral ceremony. Burning joss paper shaped like items, houses, and figures, as she had seen before. Her photo and the fan were lying in front of her, so she focused her gaze on them. I ran across that bridge. When she realized it, she found herself in a temple courtyard. Nearby, something was burning, a Chinese funeral ceremony with joss paper shaped like houses and servants, as before. Her photo and the fan lay before her, so she focused on them. She spotted Pat among the attendees. Pat approached Elle, and she recounted her experiences. She couldn't show Pat the employment details. All job details, messages, and money transferred 3 days ago vanished, as if nothing happened. Oddly, her car was at the temple. Ella insisted her experiences were real. She had been to that house, with the photo of them together. The people who attended the funeral were there, and she met Patch, who was sitting there too. Pat also noticed Elle. Pat walked over to talk to her, and she told him everything she had encountered. But something was strange. She couldn't show Pat the employment details. All hiring info and money transferred vanished as if nothing happened. Oddly, her car was at the temple too. Elle insisted her experience was real, with a photo of them together. She was puzzled by the photo of them in the house. Pat thought he knew its origin, but not how it happened. He had given the photo to the elderly woman, but Ella was confused. Pat explained his grandmother had passed, and funeral plans were made without him. Funeral elements like bells, coins, and ceremonial outfit were things Elle encountered. Pat said the ceremony was a promise to her. Ella wondered why there was a photo of her and him in that house. Pat thought he knew how it got there, but was puzzled by the situation. He had given the photo to the elderly woman, but Ella was confused. Pat's grandmother had passed, and the funeral was arranged without him. Ella. But that photo was something he had given to the elderly woman. Pat explained that his grandmother had just passed away, and the funeral arrangements were made without him knowing. Pat said that the ceremony was a promise to his grandmother, that he would bring Elle to meet her. Before she passed away, the elderly woman had told Pat that she had always wanted to meet Elle. Pat apologized to Elle for making her go through such a haunting experience. Elle understood why she had ended up in that joss paper house, because everything in that house was joss paper burned during the Chinese funeral ceremony. Just then, the image showed the elderly woman being lifted and turning to speak that same Chinese phrase again. Elle had come to meet the elderly woman, but Pat ended up breaking up with her first, so all he could do was leave their photo with the elderly woman instead. Before she passed away, the elderly woman had told Pat that she had always wanted to meet Ella. Pat apologized to Elle for making her go through such a haunting experience. At that moment, Elle understood everything. Why she had ended up in that joss paper house. Because everything in that house was joss paper that was burned during the Chinese funeral ceremony. But what still lingered in her mind was the Chinese words that the child and the elderly woman spoke. What did they mean? Then, the image showed the elderly woman being lifted and turning to speak that same Chinese phrase again. Ishitata, which means, come stay with me. And Ella's story came to an end. Mod Dam was shocked to learn that Ella had spent 3 days and 2 nights in a haunted house. He warned her to be more careful before accepting any jobs in the future, because if she really died, it wouldn't be worth it. He thanked Ella before hanging up, and turned to the sound that was still sleeping. Then the image showed that the bathroom in the station had a light shining out, along with the same Chinese phrase, take care of your heart.